European leaders have met with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in Kyiv, calling on Russia to adopt a 30-day ceasefire. The leaders of Britain, France, Germany and Poland attended the meeting, with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer threatening Russia with massive sanctions while promising Kyiv increased military aid. Now, in response, the Kremlin accused Western nations of making contradictory and confrontational statements.
Aligned with the US position, saying this should be an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, that should be without conditions, because Putin has responded by putting in conditions. We've rejected those today, but equally saying we will coordinate a response in terms of sanctions should that not be the case. So today feels like we've got one step closer to a ceasefire, which is desperately needed.
Let's get more on this with security expert Jennifer Parker from the Australian National University. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this morning.
Thanks for having me on, Fausia.
Now, this demand for Russia to observe a month-long ceasefire, of course, coming from Kyiv's allies. What happens if Moscow does not agree to the truce?
Well, look, in the lead up to this weekend, we saw Donald Trump on Truth Social talking about his frustrations with Russia and Vladimir Putin, and the US might consider further sanctions. And we've seen over this weekend that both Europe, Germany, the UK and reportedly the US have said that if Russia doesn't agree to the 30-day unconditional ceasefire commencing on the 12th, so Monday, that there will be further sanctions on the Russian economy. Now, this 30-day unconditional ceasefire, though, in many ways, this looks very similar to the plan that has been discussed since March, that was handed to both Russia and Ukraine by the US on the 17th of April. So it doesn't look very different to what's been proposed previously. So I'm not sure it's likely to be accepted by Russia.
That being the case, Russia is already under sanctions, and yet it persists to occupy parts of Ukraine. How effective would more sanctions be?
Yeah, Russia is already under sanctions that hit its banking sector. Russia has been removed from the SWIFT banking transaction system. They've had restrictions on imports of technological goods and exports of oil, diamonds, gold, etc., etc. Look, there was an estimation that the Russian economy actually did shrink by about 2% in 2022 and 2023, but may have grown slightly in 2024. And one of these reasons is that Russia is finding ways, with the assistance of countries such as Georgia or countries such as China, to get around these sanctions. One of the ways they're getting around these sanctions is, for example, exporting oil through what's called a shadow fleet, which is a kind of a dangerous, unsafe fleet that masks its ownership and linkages to Russia. But they're still managed to export oil around the world. And that is one of the areas where the UK, for example, have said they're going to further sanction those vessels, to stop them going to UK ports and potentially interdict them in UK waters. But whether this new round of sanctions will be any more effective, it's hard to say. It is impacting Russia, but is not impacting them enough to encourage them to cease the war. And they are getting significant assistance from China.
Back to this proposal, this ceasefire proposal by the Europeans. It's being backed by the Trump administration. Is this a sign that the US president's patience and admiration for the Russian leader has now expired?
Look, certainly there have been a number of indications of that in the last 2 weeks. Since Zelensky and Trump met at the previous Pope's funeral in late April, there's been reporting out of the US that Trump has privately been saying to donors that he's frustrated with Putin. He thinks Putin has changed. We actually saw J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the US, who's been probably one of the most critical of President Zelensky in Ukraine, come out around the 1st of May and say the terms that Russia are putting forward for a ceasefire, a potential end to the war, are just unacceptable. And we know what some of those terms are, which talk about, ownership of Crimea, ownership of the 4 territories in Ukraine that Russia occupies some of, but not all of, cessation of sanctions, Ukraine not joining NATO, the list kind of goes on. So we're starting to see those messaging from both Trump and J.D. Vance that they are frustrated from Russia. And we've also seen less of the rhetoric that we saw previously in terms of criticism of Zelensky. You'll remember about a month ago or so, we heard President Trump call Zelensky a dictator. Of course, he's not. He's elected president. But that rhetoric is dialing down. And I think that is aligned with the realisation that Putin is not about to end this war anytime soon.
Jennifer, we're just running out of time, but I want to try and squeeze in this one last question. We saw over the weekend China's President Xi Jinping standing alongside his Russian counterpart at the World War II commemorations in Moscow. This, of course, was a show of unity and an alternative force against the American hegemony. That's, what they wanted to project. How solid is their bond?
Look, it is increasingly solid. I don't think they necessarily trust each other, but they have aligned strategic interests at the moment. I think Australia should pay a lot of attention in terms of the closeness of China and Russia. In fact, there are even Chinese troops that were marching in that parade on the 9th of May.
Very interesting indeed. Jennifer Parker from the ANU, we thank you so much for joining us this morning and sharing your insights.
Thanks so much, Fawzia.